In one of his most eternal and memorable statements, Paul writes in Romans, the first chapter, in verse 16, that he is not ashamed of the gospel of God, because it is the power of God and salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. When Paul writes that passage, Romans chapter 1 and verse 16 and 17, he's most likely thinking about all the people that he had interacted with in his life. Even though as we read the book of Acts and we see all the different missionary journeys that he had been on, we see a bunch of kind of faceless names. We see this person was converted, this person was converted. He goes in this town, and all these people are baptized. I would imagine for Paul, those people are very real. And as he says this passage in Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, that the power of God, that the word of God is the power of God, the salvation to everyone who believes, he's thinking about all the different people that he's interacted with in his life, both people that are from small towns and from big towns. People that are of much social political influence, and people that may not be of much social political influence. Doesn't make them any less important. But his point in saying this in Romans, the first chapter, verse 16, is that the power of God, or that salvation is available to everybody, that is so powerful that it can impact everybody, no matter your station in life, no matter where you are, and especially, as we'll find out this morning, no matter what your family history is like. I know that there are a lot of people that are listening to this morning that are thinking to themselves, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. And I'm using that very kind of accommodatively. People saying, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I didn't grow up with parents who thought it was important to read and to study the Bible with me. I didn't grow up with parents who thought that it was important to take me to Bible class. And so I kind of feel like I'm kind of catching up and making up for lost time, if you can let me use that phrase. If that's the case, then as you're watching this morning, let me tell you right now that the Word of God is powerful enough to save you as well. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what your life was like. It doesn't matter how antagonistic you are towards the gospel. Every single person that reads the Bible can be saved. And that's something that we need to be shouting from the rooftops. That's something that we need to be sharing with other people. That no matter how dark and cold a heart can be, it can be thawed by the gospel. And no doubt that Paul saw this on a number of different occasions. At the end of his life, in Acts chapter 26, at least at the end of his recorded life and the end of his recorded ministry, as we can see it in Scripture, he encounters somebody who no doubt was very hostile towards the Word of God. Herod Agrippa II, Acts chapter 26, this would be his third such defense that he makes in front of either a mob, in front of rulers, or in front of people. There are three defenses, Acts 22, 24, and 26, and all three of them carry this kind of distinct voice to it. And all three of them are very similar in a lot of ways in that he encourages the people to follow and to obey God. But Acts chapter 26 is just a little bit different. In Acts the 26th chapter, starting in verse 13, kind of to set the stage for what's happening here, Paul is in prison, and he's been in prison for some time before this, but Felix, who wants to do the Jews a favor, leaves him in prison, and then you have Festus that shows up. And Festus is all of a sudden the new ruler. He's a new kid on the block, but he's a little bit unsure about what to do with somebody like Paul. Because Paul, while being a prisoner of Rome, is not really a political prisoner. He's not somebody that seems to have, striked up a whole bunch of insurrection, rebelliousness towards, the city or the empire of Rome. He's not somebody that murdered a bunch of people. He's not somebody that did anything that was really worthy of death. And you see that conundrum happening here when Agrippa II shows up. Agrippa II shows up alongside Festus, and they kind of have this little discussion here in Acts the 26th chapter about what to do with Paul the Apostle. And in verse 13 it says, Now when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. That's what we just mentioned a second ago. Now while they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, There's a man who has left as a prisoner by Felix. Now notice this conundrum that he has. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. Now I answered them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. So after they had assembled there, I didn't delay. But on the next day I took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought before me. Now when the accusers stood up, they began bringing charges against him of such crimes, or not of such crimes rather, as I was expecting. But they simply had some points of disagreement with them about their own religion and about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. Now, being at a loss as to how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar. You can almost sympathize with Festus' situation here. He didn't put this person in prison. That was Felix's doing. And Felix wants to do the Jews a favor, so he leaves Paul in prison, and now Festus is in charge. And Festus is sitting here looking at this prisoner that everybody and their mom seems to want to put to death, and yet Festus can't really decide what to do with him. He's in almost the exact same conundrum that Pilate was in. Pilate is standing there before a screaming mob as they tell Pilate that they want Jesus to be crucified. And Pilate says, what evil has he done? What did he do to deserve this? And Festus, even in this passage, says, I didn't find any charges of him that were worthy of death, so I don't really know what to do to him. And Agrippa shows up here in Acts the 26th chapter, and he says something that I think is very interesting, and it's one of those passing comments that you don't really take the time to appreciate, or you don't really appreciate until you take the time to investigate it. In Acts the 26th chapter, verse 22, Agrippa's response back to Festus is, I also would like to hear the man myself. And Festus replies, tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. Now, on the surface, this doesn't seem to be that big of a deal. Festus lays out an extremely complex case against Paul the Apostle. Nobody knows what to do with him. You've got the mob, these religious leaders that say they want to kill him, but he hasn't really done anything worthy of death. And so I don't know how to navigate this situation. And Agrippa II, says, I want to hear what this guy has to say. Now, why would he want to hear what he has to say? Now, maybe he's hoping, as other people did, that maybe Paul would give him some money, that Paul would implicate himself some way and make him worthy of death, at least in the law's eyes. Or maybe, just maybe, Agrippa wants to hear what Jesus or what Paul is all about, specifically because the accusation towards the Jews is that Paul testifies that a dead man named Jesus, you read that in Acts 26, is still alive. And I would argue, too, that that's the part that piqued Agrippa's interest. Now, why would that make Agrippa interested in what Paul has to say? Well, I think in large part because of his family history. Agrippa II is from a family line known as the Herods. And all of us, I don't care how much you've been in the Scriptures, I don't care how much you've studied the Scriptures, you are familiar with the term Herod. You're familiar with the family line Herod. That probably piqued at least a little bit of your interest. Well, Agrippa is, at least as far as recorded history goes, is the last biblical Herod that we read about, Herod Agrippa II. But he has a long family history of interacting with Jesus and of interacting with apostles and interacting with the faith that Jesus died for. If you would, jump back to Acts the 12th chapter. Acts chapter 12, we're going to look starting in verse 1. You kind of see the same thing happening here. You have Herod Agrippa II in Acts chapter 26, but now in Acts the 12th chapter, you have his dad. In Acts the 12th chapter, starting in verse 1, you have Herod Agrippa the first that comes on the scene. And in Acts the 12th chapter, starting in verse 1, it says, now about that time, Herod the king, this is Herod Agrippa the first, laid hands on some of those who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And when he had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of the unleavened bread, which I think is the exact same time that Jesus was crucified. When he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. And so Peter was kept in the prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently to the church of God. Herod Agrippa II is in Acts chapter 26. This is Herod Agrippa I, Agrippa's father. And Herod Agrippa I here in Acts the 12th chapter has an interesting relationship with the apostles, with Jesus, because he doesn't really have any affinity for the gospel, doesn't really have any concern for it. Agrippa I is nothing more than a people pleaser. He's somebody who takes an action and sees what the people think about it. And in this case, in Acts the 12th chapter, starting in verse 1, it says that he put James to death with a sword and then watched the crowd's reaction. And when the crowd responded favorably towards that, he then put Peter in prison with the express purpose here in Acts the 12th chapter of putting him to death after the Passover, which is not many days from that point in time. And of course, you know the rest of this story. You know in Acts the 12th chapter that you have the prayer that is being made on behalf of him by all the church. The angel comes in, unlocks the prison, and then Peter steps out and goes on about his life. And then you have the end of the story. In Acts the 12th chapter where Herod Agrippa II meets his untimely end. In Acts the 12th chapter, starting in verse 20, it says, now he was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. This is kind of a historical aside, but it gives a nice fitting conclusion to Herod Agrippa's life. Now he was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and with one accord they came to him, and having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace because their country was fed by the king's country. And on an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat in the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. No doubt, at least partially, about these historical aside in verse 20. The people kept crying out in verse 22, "The voice of a God and not of a man." And immediately, an angel of the Lord struck him because he didn't give God the glory. And he was eaten by worms and died. There have been a lot of people that have speculated as to what exactly Herod's death means. Did it mean that he was standing there and that a whole bunch of worms just came up on him while he was standing there and ate him in front of all the people? That's a more graphic interpretation. Other people would say that he died and that when he was put in his tomb, that the worms came and ate him, and it's just kind of a natural death. Regardless of how you look at it, Herod met an untimely end. And the reason Herod Agrippa I met an untimely end was because of his arrogance. There are two things you learn about Herod Agrippa I from Acts chapter 12, even in these 9 verses that are recorded about him. The first being that he's somebody who cares very, very much about his ego. He cares so much about what people think about him that instead of quieting down the people who are claiming that he has the voice of a God, he indulges in it. He glories in it. He wraps himself up in it. And the exact purpose, the exact reason for his death, as laid out by Acts 12th chapter, is that he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. He's a man that cares very much about his ego. He's also a man that cares very much about what the people think about him. And as we go throughout this lesson, you'll notice that that's a characteristic of Herod that's not just unique to Agrippa I, but literally every single Herod that you read about in Scripture, including also not only Herod Agrippa I, but Herod Antipas. In Luke, the 13th chapter, in verse 31, you have a new Herod that comes on the scene. And this isn't the father of Herod Agrippa I. This is actually his uncle. And there's some backstory about why Agrippa I ends up becoming in power, even though Herod Antipas is his uncle. We won't go into that right now. But in Luke, the 13th chapter, in verse 31, you have a few verses that tell you literally every single thing you need to know about Herod Antipas. And Herod Antipas in Luke, the 13th chapter, starting in verse 31, it says that just at that sometime some Pharisees approached, saying to him, "Go away, leave here, for Herod wants to kill you." Now that's Herod Antipas. And there are some people that have speculated about the reason why these Pharisees saw fit to inform Jesus of this. Some people think that they're being honest and that they genuinely want to protect Jesus. They want him to stay safe. I don't really know if I agree with that, considering all the other things that happen. More likely explanation, in my opinion, is that these are people who wanted Jesus to leave and they didn't care how they left. They just wanted to get rid of him. But notice Jesus' response in verse 32. He said to them, "Go and tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I reach my goal. Nevertheless, I must journey on today and tomorrow and the next day, for it cannot be that a prophet would perish outside of Jerusalem." Jesus is very much aware of the fact that he's going to die. And so for that reason, the Pharisees' accusation, the Pharisees' warning, doesn't really impact Jesus a whole lot. He knows that's going to be the end. The only matter is when. And Jesus is very careful about that time. But Jesus knows he's going to die. So for that reason, he doesn't really care what the Pharisees have to say about them. But you ask the question, why is it that Herod is even pursuing Jesus in the first place? And the answer is because Herod's quite frankly afraid of him. And Luke, the 9th chapter, go back all the way to Luke, the 9th chapter. We're going to jump around just a little bit here in this gospel. But look in Luke, the 9th chapter. Luke chapter 9, starting in verse 7. It says, "Now Herod the Tetrarch heard all that was happening, and he was greatly perplexed, because it was said by some that John had risen from the dead, and by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the prophets of old had risen again. And Herod said, I myself had John beheaded, but who is this man about whom I hear such things? And he kept trying to see him." Herod Antipas is very interested in who Jesus is, not because he wants to learn more about the faith, but because he probably wants to be a little entertained by him. And so he says, who is this guy? He confuses him with Elijah, who many prophesied would come, especially in that day. Elijah would come back to the world. But Herod is worried about the fact that it's John the Baptist. And if you know anything about the story, you know that Herod Antipas had John the Baptist beheaded because of an oath that he made to Herodias, who danced before him, and he promised her that he would give her up to half of his kingdom. Herodias responds and with the head of John the Baptist on a silver platter. Herod has to give it to her. So Herod Antipas had John the Baptist are murdered before this moment. But notice the similarities. Jesus' teaching is so powerful and so moving and so persuasive amongst the people that Herod believes John the Baptist has resurrected from the dead. Now, where did he get that? Look in verse 1. Look earlier in this, in Luke the 9th chapter, verse 1. It says, "Now Jesus called the 12 together, gave them power and authority over all the demons to heal diseases, and he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to perform healing. And he said to them, 'Take nothing for your journey, neither a staff, nor a bag, nor bread, nor money, and do not even have 2 tunics apiece. Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that city. And as for those who do not receive you, as you go out from that city, shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them.'" Go out and preach the gospel, Jesus says. That's what I want you to do. Listen to the impact in verse 6. "Departing, they began going throughout the villages, preaching the gospel and healing everywhere." The impact of Jesus' teaching was very much felt in the first century, to the point that everybody that even remotely heard or was in that area heard at least a little bit about Jesus. They maybe heard about his miracles. They maybe heard about his teachings. They maybe heard about something he had done, but they heard something about Jesus. And Jesus' fame was so widespread that by the time you get to Luke the 9th chapter, verse 7 through 9, and then later in Luke chapter 13, Herod is at least somewhat interested in Jesus. Probably not because he wants to hear what he has to say, but maybe because he wants to be entertained, but ultimately also because he probably wants to put him to death. In Luke the 23rd chapter, jump to the end of this book, Luke chapter 23, we mentioned Pilate a little bit earlier. Pilate was somebody who essentially just kind of washes his hands. Actually, very literally, he just washes his hands of Jesus. In Luke the 23rd chapter, he gets a little bit of a relief when he finds out that Herod Antipas, who is who we're talking about now, is actually in the neighborhood and has jurisdiction over Pilate as to what's happening. Herod Antipas is the rightful ruler of Judea. And in Luke chapter 23, starting in verse 6, it says, "Now when Pilate heard it," talking about the stirring up of the people, even from Galilee, happens in the first 5 verses, "he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at that time." This is Herod Antipas. "Now Herod," verse 8, "was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him, was hoping to see some sign performed by him, and he questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently. And Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and then sent him back to Pilate. Now Herod," verse 12, "and Pilate then became friends with one another, because they had been enemies before that." Note Herod's treatment of Jesus. Number one, he confuses him with John the Baptist because Jesus' fame is so overpowering. But number two, he brings Jesus to him at this point, or welcomes Jesus into his assembly, because he wants to be entertained by him somehow. "Show me a little miracle. What you got for me, Jesus? I want to see something." But then he also questions him at length, and nobody knows the content of that questioning, but he questions him at length about his miracles, about his work, about his ministry, whatever it is, questions him at length. Jesus doesn't respond, and so Herod's response to that is to dress him up into a robe and mock him and beat him. Herod Antipas is no friend of Jesus, because whereas you saw Pilate kind of interact with him and say that he's innocent and wash his hands in the matter, Herod essentially has fun at Jesus' expense. Herod Antipas is no friend to Jesus. He's no friend to his teaching. He's no friend to the gospel at all. That's not surprising considering who Herod Antipas's dad is. Now, this is the one that everybody knows when they think of Herod. When you think of Herod, most likely you think of Herod the Great. Herod the Great is the father of Herod Antipas. He's the great uncle of Herod Agrippa I. He's the great uncle of Herod Agrippa II. And he's the one that essentially begins this family line of torture and persecution and condemnation, not only of Jesus, but also of his apostles. When you look in the Old Testament and the New Testament, you see a few villains that kind of jump out. In the New Testament, you can't form a list of villains without putting Herod the Great, at least some part on that. In the Old Testament, you have somebody like Pharaoh, who was responsible in Exodus chapters 1 and 2 with essentially infanticide for an entire nation, killing thousands of Hebrew babies in order to secure Egypt's place in history and to secure his empire. Herod the Great does the exact same thing. As a matter of fact, if you look at Matthew, the 2nd chapter, Matthew chapter 2, one of the very first introductions that we have to Jesus, into his relationship with the world. You can see at the beginning, it's hostile. In Matthew chapter 2, starting verse 1, it says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him.' Now when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Gathering together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they said to him, 'In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. You, Bethlehem, land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers or the leaders of Judah. For out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.' Then Herod," verse 7, "secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time that the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me so that I may too come and worship him.' After hearing the king, they went their way, and the star which they had seen these went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was." You have 2 or 3 or 5 or however many Magi that come from the east with the express purpose of worshiping Jesus. They saw his star. They know that he's a king. They want to come and worship him. And so they interact with Herod at this point. They ask for permission. "Maybe do you know where this great king is? Because we want to go and worship him." And Herod, perceiving a threat to his rule, sends them to Bethlehem. That's where the prophet said, "Go to Bethlehem." Sends them. But then he tells them, when you find him, go back and report to me where you find him, because I too would like to worship him. Of course, the Magi don't know any better. They don't know who Herod is, so they go on about their way. But listen to this. At the end of verse 16, the Magi are warned not to return back to Herod. And it says in verse 16 that when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Then, verse 17, what had been spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they were no more. Herod is responsible for infanticide in the same way that Pharaoh was in Exodus chapters 1 and 2. And there's no doubt that Herod is the New Testament counterpart to that, because in order to secure his throne, he orders the annihilation of dozens, if not hundreds, of innocent male babies. What a horrible tragedy. And you see that prophesied there in verse 18 about this tragedy that would show up. But if you jump back to who Herod is, you think about where he is in his life, and you think about his children and his descendants and where they're going to be, you notice some similarities. First and foremost, you see a man who is obsessed with power. Now that's unique to Herod the Great. You see that a little bit with Herod Antipas, you saw that a little bit with Agrippa the First, but that is something that is most likely kind of peculiar just to who Herod the Great is. But the second thing that seems to fit in right with the family line is his obsession with his ego and with his place among people. He is so obsessed, Herod the Great is, with who he is and his power and his popularity that he cannot stand anybody taking that out from underneath him. There's a story that Josephus tells that when Herod the Great knew that he was about to die, that he ordered the execution of 100 Jewish leaders from Jerusalem and the surrounding vicinity, because he knew that when he died, there would be nobody that would mourn his death. And what he wanted was those 100 Jewish leaders to be killed so that there would be weeping when Herod the Great himself died. Herod the Great is somebody who is obsessed with power. He's somebody who is obsessed with his place in the world. He's obsessed with fame. The way that he came to power, the way that he secured power, the way that he created alliances. There is death every step of the way. And it all began with Herod the Great. So right here at the outset, you see this animosity. You see this contention between Herod the Great and Jesus and who their descendants and their apostles would eventually be. In Matthew chapter 23, I think you see at least a little bit of what Jesus is talking about here. Matthew chapter 23, starting in verse 1. Matthew chapter 23, starting in verse 1, it says, "Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, 'The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe. But don't do according to their deeds. For they say things and don't do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. They love the place of honor at the banquets and the chief priests and the chief seats in the synagogues. They love the respectful greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by men. But do not, verse 8, be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, and you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. Jesus issues a stinging condemnation to the Pharisees in this passage. People who are obsessed with telling other people what to do and yet not doing anything about it. In Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 10, Jesus gives a complete breakdown of what leadership looks like. Leadership is not about exerting your influence on other people. It's not about seeing how many people can praise you. It's not about issuing commands that you yourself have no intention of following through on. It's about servitude. That's what leadership is all about, ladies and gentlemen. In verse 11, he says, "But the greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted." Make no mistake about it, guys. Herod the Great exalted himself. Herod Antipas exalted himself. Herod Agrippa I exalted themselves. And every single one of them met their end somehow. They reserved that place of honor for themselves instead of keeping it for God where it belonged. And in doing so, they hunted down, they pursued, they attacked all the different apostles of Jesus. They attacked Jesus himself. They attacked the gospel to the end of the world. And yet, what was the success rate on that? In today's world, you have the gospel that is flourishing. And the persecution now is still very violent in certain parts of the world, but the persecution from Herod is long gone. And Herod's family line has been long gone. And yet the gospel still stands. But you can see that animosity that existed. You can see that hatred that existed from the Herods towards Jesus, toward his apostles, towards the gospel. And yet I would argue that when you look back at Acts the 26th chapter, go back there. When you look back at Acts chapter 26, you see that thawing a little bit. As a matter of fact, there's a reason why we began talking about Paul and not Herod. It'd be very easy when you talk about how bad the Herods are to just kind of look at Herod himself and completely ignore Paul. But I think the positioning of this passage and the way this text flows shows a lot more similarity between who Paul is and the Herods are than we care to admit. You remember, of course, that Paul himself was one of the greatest persecutors of the early church that they ever knew. Paul dragged people out of houses, threw them in prison, traveled most of Judea, dragging the apostles and the preachers and the teachers and the disciples of Christ into prison, persecuting them. As a matter of fact, he even tells them that I stood by when Stephen was persecuted. I held the coats of the ones who threw the stones. Paul hated Christianity, if not more than the Herods did. And so when you look at Acts chapter 26 and the way that you have Paul the apostle, the greatest persecutor that the church has ever known, arguably at that point in time, for a period of time, against Herod Agrippa II, who descends from a family who absolutely hated Jesus with all of their being, everything that they were. In my opinion, you see a very thorough understanding of the gospel at work. You see what it looks like when grace is revealed, when people begin to realize the truth of the gospel. In Acts the 26th chapter, as we mentioned earlier, when you see in Acts chapter 26 this phrase that he mentions here in verse 29, or in Acts chapter 25, when you see this phrase in verse 22 that Agrippa says to Festus, I would also like to hear this man myself. What you know going into it after we've gone through all that is that Agrippa has a long family history of people that deal with Jesus. And that when Paul preaches about this dead man Jesus who Paul claims to be alive, Agrippa knows exactly who he's talking about. And so in Acts chapter 26, starting in verse 12, Paul's defense against them is literally a breakdown of how somebody who is hostile towards God can now be friendly towards them. In Acts chapter 26, starting in verse 12, he says, while so engaged as I was journeying to Damascus with the authority and the commission of the chief priests, at midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining all around me and those who were journeying with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew dialect, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Now, this is something that we remember from Acts 9th chapter, but it's repeated here by Paul to emphasize the fact that you cannot win against God. Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight. My kingdom will not fall to Satan. It won't fall at all. And so when he says here that he says it is hard for you to kick against the goads, Paul responds, what do you mean by that? Who are you, Lord? The Lord said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. Get up, stand on your feet. For this purpose I have appeared to you, to appoint you as a minister and a witness not only to the things which you have seen, but also to the things which I will appear to you. Rescue you from the Jewish people, from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the dominion of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in me. Paul could have chosen anything to tell Agrippa about this encounter. But the way that he phrases his defense to Agrippa is as somebody who is hostile towards God and is now friendly towards God. How does that kind of transformation take place? It takes place when you realize that you're fighting against truth and that you're propagating falsehood and that it will eventually cost you your soul. Now listen to how Paul builds on this in verse 19. So King Agrippa, I didn't prove disobedient to the heavenly vision, but I kept declaring both to those of Damascus first and also at Jerusalem, and then throughout all the region of Judea, even to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God, performing deeds appropriate to repentance. For this reason, some Jews then seized me in the temple and tried to put me to death. People that are still antagonistic towards God. So having obtained help from God, I stand to this day testifying both to small and to great, stating nothing but what the prophets and Moses said was going to take place. A, that the Christ was to suffer. B, that by reason of his resurrection from the dead, he would be the first to proclaim light both to the Jewish people, C, and also to the Gentiles. Paul characterizes himself in this passage as being, number one, somebody who was formerly a persecutor to somebody who now is its most ardent proponent. How did that transformation take place? He was confronted with the truth. It's as simple as it was. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't as if God opened up his heart and jammed the gospel in there. God confronted him with the truth, and Paul accepted it. Not everybody did. And the people that put him in front of Agrippa at that moment were the ones that are still hostile towards it. In other words, you want to know why I'm standing here? It's not because I was an insurrectionist. It's not because I was rebellious towards Rome. It's because I preached truth and everybody else hated it. But at this point in time, Paul fixates his attention on Agrippa, and I love how Paul does that. Nearly every sermon that Paul has, he brings it home to that specific audience. And here at this point, he's addressing Agrippa, whose family, for nearly 80 years at this point, has been hostile to Christianity. Verse 24, while Paul was saying this in his defense, Festus said in a loud voice, Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you mad. These are things that crazy people say. Paul said, I'm not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I utter words of sober truth. And then fixing his eyes on Agrippa, he says, for the king knows about these matters. And I speak to him also with confidence, since I am persuaded that none of these things escape his notice. For this hasn't been done in a corner. You know this, Agrippa. You were bred into this life. From your earliest years, you've heard about the persecution that your ancestors put towards Christianity. King Agrippa, verse 27, do you believe the prophets? The ones who prophesied about Christ and about the fulfillment of the law that I just talked to you about? Do you believe in the prophets? I know that you do. And then Agrippa replied to Paul, in a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian. What a beautiful moment. Because in this one verse, and people have preached on almost persuaded, we talk about how close Agrippa came. That is worth talking about. But notice how far Agrippa has come. Agrippa's father killed James, almost killed Peter. Agrippa's great uncle presided over Jesus' trial. Agrippa's great uncle was the one who tried to kill Jesus before he was dead. And now you have Herod's descendant who is this close to becoming a Christian. Ladies and gentlemen, if that's not grace in action, I don't know what is. And Paul said in verse 29, I would wish to God that whether in a short time or a long time, not only you, but also to all who hear me this day, might become such as I am, except for these chains. Paul positions himself in Acts chapter 26 as being where Agrippa was. I was hostile. I hated God. I hated Jesus. I hated Christianity. But I learned the truth. And so can you. What an amazing story that would have been if Agrippa had taken that next step and become a Christian. But I would argue, too, that it's still an amazing story. The fact that the gospel can penetrate even into people who have every reason in the world to hate God, it can penetrate even into their hearts when they learn the truth. And it's not for nothing. In Luke, the 6th chapter, or 8th chapter, verse 3, for instance, you have Joanna, who is the wife of Chuza, who is talked about as being close to Herod. She's converted. In Acts chapter 13, verse 1, it says, now there was in Antioch, the church where there were prophets and teachers, Barnabas and Simeon, and also who was called Niger, and Lucy of Cyrene and Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch. You have a close personal friend of Herod, now that's a leading influential member of the church in Jerusalem. Paul will talk about how people in Caesar's household were converts towards Christianity. The gospel penetrated even into the darkest places of the Roman Empire. What an amazing testimony of God's grace. And that's why when you read Romans chapter 1, verse 16, what we read at the beginning of this lesson, when you read Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, and Paul talks about how the word of God is the power of God unto salvation, both to the Jew first and to the Greek, he is drawing from his own personal experience. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul saw the gospel work in the hearts of some of the coldest and most hostile people towards Christianity that the world has ever seen. And if it can penetrate into their hearts, and that if he can see when people are confronted with the truth, they can also become Christians, then what's our excuse? There's no doubt that a lot of us know people, have friends that are hostile towards God, that hate him, don't come to worship services, have a Bible that maybe sits in their cabinets. Maybe they've read it a few times, but they don't really care. They're apathetic, which in some cases is worse than hating the gospel. But they're not ever, as we would put it, candidates for conversion. And I hate that phrase even to begin with. This story should prove to us that everyone can be saved. Paul stood as himself as a demonstrator of God's grace and talked to somebody who had come from a family line of people that hated God. And he was this close to becoming a Christian. What a fantastic story. Could have been better, but what a fantastic story. My challenge for you this week is to go out and to find those people that you know are hostile towards God and just expose them to the truth. The one best advice that we can give in terms of evangelism is that it's not our responsibility to force people to become Christians, force people into the baptistry. Our responsibility is to tell them. Paul didn't fail with Agrippa. He didn't fail because Agrippa did not become a Christian. At least as far as we know, he didn't fail. He did his duty. And for that, he was a success. And so will you be. Let's bow together in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for the opportunity that we have to worship you, even in these through this digital means. We thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to learn from your word. We're thankful for the opportunity to partake of the Lord's Supper together. We're thankful, Lord, for the opportunity to still be together, even in a digital format, and still worship you together as we are this morning. We pray, Lord, for opportunities. We know that there are people in our circles that need the gospel, that need God. We pray, Lord, first that you would open our eyes to see those people. And number two, that you would also give us the courage we need to simply tell them the truth about God's word. That we would see if we can help their hearts be just a little bit more thawed by presenting the gospel to them, by teaching them the way that all of us should go. We pray, Lord, that you would give us strength and give us courage. These things we pray in your Son's name.